Hi, everyone. My name is Julianne Smith. I'm one of the occupational therapists here at the Teach Group, and I am continuing on with our primitive reflex series where I will be talking about the spinal galant reflex. So, what are primitive reflexes? To first talk about the spinal galant, we like to talk about what are primitive reflexes. There are several. They are involuntary and automatic movements that infants have either in utero, so meaning in the mother's womb, or after birth that serve a specific purpose for development or survival. So these are given to us for those reasons when we're a baby, and they solely serve the purpose for those reasons. So what we should start to see is that these reflexes integrate, meaning that they should disappear once the purpose is no longer needed. So this is when a child's movement starts to become more voluntary and controlled. So the best way I like to describe it is that when we're babies, we don't have like the skill set yet to have very like advanced motor movements. So we're kind of programmed with these reflexes that help with survival or development. But as we get older, we start to have more purposeful and more voluntary motor actions and motor plans. So we no longer need these reflexes anymore. So, primitive reflexes are fundamental for the development of muscle tone, sensory integration, head body control, eye hand coordination, and just overall development. Retained reflexes can affect motor and learning skills. So, that is why we talk about these today. Retained means that these reflexes are still present. So, what is the spinal galant reflex? The spinal galant reflex begins in utero and is prompted by the touch to either or both sides of the spine, so either sides of the spine, and it prompts the hip to kind of curve to that stimulus to the spine. This is a really neat reflex because it is to serve the purpose of helping the mother through the birthing process. When you think about it, when a baby's going through the birthing canal and the mother is having contractions, those contractions are stimulating the spinal galant reflex. So it's the helping the baby kind of groove and move to go through the birthing canal. So that is the purpose for when the baby is in utero and helping through the birthing process. But after birth, the spinal galant reflex aids in establishing awareness of like the left and right side of the body, development of range of motion in the hip, which prepares the baby for walking and crawling, and it aids in the development of balance and coordination, all very important things. So we expect to see the reflex integrate by 3 to 9 months old, meaning start to go away. So why does integration matter? Why do we want these reflexes to disappear per se? So, research has shown that a retained spinal galant reflex can relate to several different factors I've mentioned here in the PowerPoint. So, the first one can be excessive fidgeting. So, an older child who might have a retained spinal galant reflex, um, when you think about it, for it to trigger that reflex, it's that stimulus to the back. When a child is sitting in a chair all day at school, they're constantly leaning up against the back of their chair. So it's constantly rubbing that spinal galant reflex and it triggers an automatic muscular response. So they might be moving a lot in their chair and they might not even be meaning to. It's just that spinal galant kind of taking over that involuntary motor pattern of moving and fidgeting in their seat. And this can directly correlate to attention and focus issues and poor concentration. Because if you feel uncomfortable in your seat, how can you expect to be able to pay attention in class or other settings? We also see bedwetting after the age of 5. So, research has shown that stimulation to the spinal galant reflex on the side of the spine it can cause a pelvic reaction that then elicits urination or incontinence. So when you think about a child when they're in bed, they're constantly just tossing and turning. They might be triggering that spinal galant reflex on their back when they're tossing and turning in bed, and then that elicits that urination. So they end up having bedwetting accidents past the age of like diapers. So it's really interesting to see how the correlation between the two. So that was just an interesting point. Next, we can see balance and coordination deficits. So this can affect core and trunk stability, which affects the entire body. Um, when we are kind of leaning to one side, or if the spinal galant might be present on one side, you can expect a child might lean a certain way, and that might help make their muscles develop in a different way, and they might be kind of unstable in their core and their trunk. So that's another aspect. We see hypersensitivity. So when you think about clothing all day long is on our back, things that might be tight fitting, might be rough fabric, things like that. And then we see like postural deficits kind of goes hand in hand with like the balance and coordination, the trunk and core stability and all of that. So this is some of the things we see that can happen when we have a retained spinal galant reflex. I like to include this visual because I feel like it's so important to help like understand why integrating these reflexes are so important. This is what we call the pyramid of learning, and it's basically talking about like our central nervous system and how it develops when we're a child. You can see on the bottom, we have like our sensory systems, they start to develop, and then it just goes up the pyramid. I like to explain it as a house. A lot of times people try when they're like looking at certain areas or maybe concerns in a child, they try to start to look at the top of the pyramid, like school skills, behavior, things like that. But we cannot build a house starting with the roof first or the walls. We have to build the foundation first. So this visual kind of shows that we have to start first at the bottom with the sensory system and work on those sensory processing skills and then move our way up. And you can see on the second tier of the pyramid, that's where we have our sensory motor development, and you can see reflex maturity. That means reflex integration. So all of this means is that when we build a super strong foundation, the top of the pyramid becomes even stronger, and we start to see more advances and skill sets develop in those areas once we target those things on the bottom first. So I always like to include that because I feel like it's super important for parents to see why as OTs we focus on these things first before we tackle harder cognitive, maybe behavioral things like that at the top of the pyramid. So how we assess a spinal galant as an OT is we have the child start on their hands and knees on the floor. We stroke one side of the spine downward using our finger, or I put a stimulus, so that could be like a pencil or just something kind of like that mimics a finger. We watch for hip shifting, rotation, or imbalance. So when a child kind of has like a exaggerated movement, when I do that stroke down the spine, that lets me know that hip is curving and that spinal galant involuntary motor pattern is still present. We do this on both sides of the spine to test it. I like to put a little blurb at the bottom that said it's super important to note a child can show a retained retention, like a retained spinal galant on one side of the body and not on the other side, but it would still be deemed as them having a positive spinal galant reflex. So they might not curve or have that exaggerated movement, and they might be completely still on one side, but they might have that spinal galant on the other side of their spine. So we do the testing, we talk about why it's important. The next thing is how do we integrate them? So, as OTs, we give a lot of different integration activities. The list goes on, but I've just included some in the PowerPoint that are helpful and some that we typically use in our clinic. So, the first one is the snow angel. This one is pretty self-explanatory, but I gave pictures to kind of show it. What we want is for it to be slow and controlled, and our arms and legs to go at the same time. Sometimes kids like to do them super fast, and that's not the best way to like integrate. It's not how to do the true exercise. So we like them slow and controlled. Another one is what we call heel taps. This is where a child is on their back, like you can see in the picture, and they're kind of moving side to side, tapping their heels. That's kind of getting that spinal galant reflex used to that stimulation, because one way to integrate the spinal galant is kind of like overexposure to the reflex in the back to kind of make it get used to that stimulus. Next is a rolling ball exercise. So you can see in the picture, the child has their knees bent and they're holding their ankles, and they're just rolling backwards in that motion, kind of like a C or a ball, and that's kind of triggering that spinal galant. Next is the plank side tap. So a child is in a plank position and they're moving their legs, their legs out to the side and doing taps. And then just really simple activities are things like crawling, rolling, sensory play. Vibration is also a really good one, like I talked about. Sometimes exposing the spinal galant to more tactile input and sensory input. So, like a vibrating massager on both sides of the spine can help get the back more used to like that stimulus and being touched in that area. So maybe it won't be triggered as easily in the bed or like with clothing and things like that. Tummy time for babies is really good. And then another one is sit walks. So that's where you sit on your bottom and you kind of inch up with your hips. You use your hips to kind of move you forward. That is also some other activities that are great for integrating the spinal galant reflex. So we're at the end of the presentation. In conclusion, the most important thing is consistent practice and exercise activities is what helps integrate the reflex. The more we do these activities, it helps the brain start to adapt to different level motor patterns. So we need consistent practice and implementation in order to see the reflex truly integrate. I always like to add when I'm talking to parents, retained reflexes are common and treatable, but that does not mean anything is wrong with your child if they do have a retained reflex. This is common. It happens a lot with our kids. There's probably adults walking around that have retained reflexes. So it's just kind of things that happen in development that might just kind of happen by chance. So, but that's where we come in as OTs to help integrate these reflexes. Reach out to your OT if you want more information or guidance. We have a lot of different exercise activities, kind of more education and research on it. So if you want to dive a little bit deeper, definitely reach out to your OT to talk more about primitive reflexes. And then email any additional questions to socials@theteachgroup.com. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and thanks for listening.